Hi there. So this one's a bit different. We've not done this before. So Austin Wintory's 3-time Grammy-nominated composer for Journey, Aliens, Fireteam Elite, and Stray Gods. He's written the scores for Journey, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, Hades 2, Lego Fortnite, and Towerborn, which is his latest one. And he's going to show us his process. As you can see, there's a keyboard on the stage, so this is going to get fun. So Austin, if you want to come out. Big round.
Well, hello.
Hello. So you
Not how I normally enter rooms, so that's very exciting.
So to start with, I think you want to show everyone, play everyone some of your greatest hits, perhaps.
Well, I thought it could be fun, since part of the goal of what I want to tell you all about is the way that interactive music works on a particular project that it's out right now in early access with Xbox called Towerborn, and we did some interesting shenanigans with the interactive music. Interactive music has been an obsession of mine, though, for basically every project I've worked on, all the way back to the days of Flow, almost 20 years ago. Crazy to think. And so, yeah, I thought, well, you know, I could step you through the process, and then we'll make our way to Towerborn.
Okay.
This has nothing to do with me. I will be using this quite a bit, though. So, yeah, in any case, well, I figured I'd start with Journey. I could mention Flow. Very simple. One of the things that's a truism for me is every project should feel like it can be distilled down to some really, really basic essence. So the first thing I always ask when someone hires me is, what is this about, fundamentally? Like, yes, okay, they might say, oh, it's a platformer, it's an action-adventure, story about this and that, but I always say that's not what it's about. What it's about is something more foundational, more even primal. So, for example, I remember Genova Chen, the founder of that game company, telling me about Journey at the Flower launch party. I didn't work on Flower, but obviously longtime friends of that game company, supporter of everything they do, and we were talking, and he basically, the takeaway I had from that conversation was, at its very essence, this is a game about starting very lonely and discovering a kind of cathartic release from that loneliness. And so much about Journey is about that. So then it was one of those really freak lucky things. Sorry to keep messing with this. It just really wants to fall off. I walked to my car, and I remember I left a voicemail where I said, start with cello going. Very basic. You know, it's solemn. The idea was something super introspective, right? And, you know, sometimes I end up spending weeks or even months on this part of it. For whatever reason, Journey, I got really lucky because I literally walked away from the meeting, left myself a voicemail spelling all of that out, and recorded it that afternoon with the cellist Tina Guo, the flute player Amy Tatum, did some shenanigans with my computer, and we literally never changed it again.
So when you leave yourself a voicemail, do you just kind of describe the tone, or do you sometimes like hum a melody?
It's quite literally start with solo cello, bum 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 bum. Then bass flute comes in, then we bring in a harp and the strings, and then it probably sounds like absolute nonsense to the ravings of a madman to an outside listener. In fact, now it was a voicemail back then because it was 2009, where I literally had to dial myself from my little flip phone. Now, you know, you've got the fancy voice memo software on the phone, so I can leave myself an actual, you know, note that might be 15 minutes long. My fantasy is that I want to develop some software that when my heart stops and I'm dead, it will delete every one of those wherever they are, because it's worse than blackmail and incriminating. It's like the most raw version of myself, and it's awful. So yes, but in that case, it actually contained the heart of what mattered. So in contrast, take a game like Abzu, which was in so many respects the kind of spiritual successor to Journey, Giant Squid's debut title. It drew a lot from Journey in a mechanical way, but it was sort of the exact opposite emotionally. So it was like, all right, how do I make it, you know, sort of feel like it's of a cloth, but the opposite. So the simple melody of this, you know, not much to it. In fact, I'm a believer that melodies, you know, you should be able to play it with one finger and it shouldn't sound like much. But then you put it in that context and you have like, we had all these harps, for example, do this swirling kind of textures where you get this sort of, you know. You know, it's very, very different than that simple, you know, even though they're cousins in a way, you know what I mean? And so yeah, this part, it's funny how you just play a few notes and it seems like nothing. It feels like, yeah, okay, it's just, probably anybody in here could come up with that. And yet it always is so hard. It always feels like it's just weeks or at minimum days of staring at, you know, a blank page or the piano or whatnot before it feels like it kind of clicks and reveals itself. Is any of this making sense?
It's making total sense.
Yeah,
so,
it's
so
good.
with
Does
that,
this make sense to you guys? Is this just, I'm not just rambling, right? So yeah, that, how are we on time? Because it's going to go by in a heartbeat.
We're doing all right.
All right, good.
Move on to the next.
I'll give you an example of another one. So stark contrast to that. Banner Saga. Anyone here familiar with those games? Banner Saga trilogy, turn-based strategy, absolutely brilliant. Stoic, same folks who made Towerborn, which we'll be talking about shortly. This was my first project with them. It was a trilogy of games. We started in 2012. Absolutely brilliant. One of my absolute just most treasured things I've ever been involved in. And I remember one of the first things that I got from talking to them was that this is not really a heroic save the world story, but it's a stare death in the face, you know, confront your doom with a kind of courage. You know, it's almost like death with dignity. It wasn't, you know, you're going to stop everything and be the hero. And so I found myself thinking about a funeral march as the foundation of that score. So it ended up being this very brass-heavy, low, very quiet, you know. You know, you could just imagine it with a solo French horn or something, and then we can do it in a much more funeral march way, you know. You know, it's very heavy. Piano doesn't do it justice. If I had my way, we'd have 75 musicians up here with me, and I could really demonstrate what we're talking about. But sadly, apparently money and logistics are real things we have to consider. It's a damn shame, but
so
yeah.
for something like that, where would inspiration strike for that? Is it when you're in the studio, or like in the shower, or?
It's all the above. I get a lot, you know, living in LA, we spend a lot of time in our car. Invariably, you know, the mind wanders. It's one of those where if you've ever gone stargazing, you know, go out to the countryside or somewhere where there's not a lot of light pollution, you look at the stars. For the really, really dim stars, the conventional wisdom is always try to look near them, but not directly at them, because we have a bit of a blind spot in the direct center of our eye. So if you really want to see something, you have to kind of look next to it if it's really, really low light. And I always think writing music feels exactly the same way. I have to kind of think about something else in order to really let the ideas come. Because if I sit down, yeah, okay, I could sit here and improvise, like I'll just bullshit a melody here for you, so. Okay, fine. That never existed before. But it's generic. It's one of those where if it's pure craft or pure technique, it's not drawing from something deeper, and it's certainly not reflective of ideas that are going to be specific to that game. You know, one of my whole obsessions is how do I make a thing that feels like I could only have ever thought of it in the context of this task? Like Banner Saga Funeral March. this melody would not have occurred to me were I not thinking about the specific ideas of that game. You know what I
Do you
mean?
find that the game directors have a pretty strong opinion that aligns with how you feel about it? Or, I mean, are you telling them, this is what I'm getting out of this?
This is going to quickly turn into a political conversation. I mean, yes, at the end of the day, it's always a bit of a melding of minds. And my goal is to try to crawl inside their head and figure out what they're looking for. By that same token, though, they are often looking to me and saying, tell us what we
So are they saying, like, are you telling them, you're making a really sad game? And they're like, no, I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there is a little bit of that where they don't realize quite what they've made, and then I get to be a slightly objective viewer and say, well, it's like if in their mind, on Journey, it was this super happy-go-lucky, like teen romance game, and I come with this. I'd like to think that I was making clear to them, this is the game you're actually making. Of course, it's contingent on me actually seeing the game clearly, which, every now and again I'll be working on a project and someone will say, well, it's actually this, and I'll realize, oh my God, yeah, you're right. Everything I was writing is not going to fit. Let me have at it again. So I love that. I love when my mind is sort of open beyond what my first instincts told me, because below those are theoretically something deeper and something hopefully with a little more substance or nuance or originality or something like that.
So Towerborn is the most recent thing you've worked on.
Yes.
And it sounds like that was, you mentioned 70 musicians. That sounds like it was a big production. So can you talk a little bit about how you went about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Towerborn, it's the same studio as Banner Saga, Stoic. And we did this trilogy of games, and then they started telling me about what's next. And if you've played the Banner Saga, they are very depressing, dark. The goal was, let's take turn-based strategy in the vein of a game like XCOM or Final Fantasy Tactics and mix it with almost like an Oregon Trail sense of constant no-win dilemmas, and then just crank up the depression of it. And I remember our creative director, Arnie, was getting towards the end, and he said, all right, I've spent the last 7-8 years working on a game, and my young kids don't want to play this game. It's sort of too slow and depressing for them. And he said that, as a young dad, I'd like to be able to work on a game I can actually play with my kids, and we can sort of both have meaningful experiences, like a Pixar film, or tellingly, like a Studio Ghibli Miyazaki film. And so he said, we want to make something that's sort of a hard 180 from the emotions of the Banner Saga. This thing should sort of burst with optimism and joy, and at its most heavy and dark, not be especially heavy and dark. It's supposed to have that kind of optimistic joyousness that in my mind is what video games largely started as. When you think of, like, what's the darkest that Mario ever gets? It's not like dark by comparison to, The Last of Us. So we wanted to tap into that sort of classic joy. And, apropos where this conversation started, I sat down and said, all right, well, it is going to be a 2D or 2.5D side-scrolling brawler, but there's still this idea that there's a kind of nobility hidden inside the underlying story. So the melody is actually quite simple. This. But in my mind, there's a sort of hopeful quality to this that's not like all those others that I just played, especially this big opening, There's something about big intervals like that, But yes, you are not wrong to bring up that it required a giant orchestra, and we said, let's give it a big, like, old Hollywood sort of swashbuckling sort of quality as well.
Can you, do you have anything of the game that you can show?
Yes. Let's switch our screen. Okay, so this just to give you a sense of what we're looking at. There's no sound in this. Don't be alarmed. But this to give you a sense of obviously you can instantly tell first off, just the visual artistry of Stoic is incredible. Their games are just always so freaking pretty. But, and obviously there's a strong Miyazaki influence here, and I was encouraged to absorb as much of that as possible. To give you a sense, though, you can see that it's dynamic gameplay. Like, this little clip started with a bunch of bad guys on screen, and then we got rid of them. So here's another example of combat that escalates in nature. And so, you're fighting some dudes, and then even bigger ones show up, and so there's a real sense of dynamic arc, as it were, in the adventure. And a lot of this stuff, especially in the very earliest days, we were talking about systems of it being, completely and totally procedural, where even the system couldn't tell you what was going to happen next. We ended up in kind of a middle ground in that department, but either way, I was asking myself, okay, it's all well and good to do a kind of old-fashioned video gamey thing where we just plop exciting music over top, and whatever the player's doing, we just characterize it as exciting. But if you're familiar with my work at all, like in Journey or the Banner Saga or any of these others, the whole idea is that the music has to dance with you. It has to actually really be very attuned. My fantasy is that while you're playing the game at home, it should feel like I'm sort of awkwardly in the room with you, somehow writing the music live just for your playthrough. That's always the goal. So how to do that on a game like this? Immensely challenging, where especially we don't know what's going to happen necessarily. So, assuming I have audio here, oops, spoilers. In fact, that's not the right video. 1 second. All right, so here we have a graph. So I would write a piece of music. This is just like a map of the drama of a piece of music that plays while you're in combat. So the idea is, you can see it's not static. It's not going, okay, you're in action mode, and then we'll go to a different piece of music when you're out of action mode. The idea was the music should have a kind of rise and fall, and we'll let the cards fall where they fall in terms of, if the music is building right as you make, a killer blow, okay, that's really exciting, but it might also be building right as you're charging at someone or whatever. We kind of intentionally embraced a little bit of serendipity, but it has to have its own kind of musical vocabulary for these long stretches of gameplay. So this is just a little map of what it looks like. So here I can play a little taste of some of this arc. Hopefully our sound is working. So you can feel it sort of building. So of course, being obsessed with interactive music, I was like, that's not that interesting to just have something like that sitting on top of the gameplay. So then it was, what if I also made a version that's way busier? And the traditional video gamey technique that composers would use is we would split apart the orchestra or split apart whatever we're doing. If it's like Doom, you might be, grungy, gent, electric bass and a drummer and a keyboard player and whatever. But the point is, the individual components might be recorded on their own so that they can be faded in or out individually. It's actually a very tired cliche to do things like, oh, we want to ramp up the tension, so just add drums. Like every game does that. And I was desperately trying to think of how not to do that, basically. So I thought, well, what if I just write a different version of the same piece that has more complex use of the orchestra, and instead of recording it in parts where we fade in those, what if I just made a completely different recording of the orchestra so everyone is also playing louder? So you heard little bits with accordions and strings in there, and I was like, let's get them, but everybody take it up a notch, and in addition to writing it more parts on top. So here's a little what that sounded like, backing it up, refreshing everyone's memory. Okay, very simple. Now here's a high energy version of that exact same snippet of music. So we're using way more of the orchestra. There's more going on. It's obviously a little chattier, right? That's pretty clear, right? I'm not deluding myself that that's sort of instantly obvious what the difference is, right? Well, so we also want to be able to downshift. So I said, okay, we'll do the opposite. We'll have everybody in the orchestra play quietly. And on top of that, I wanted to do things like, I'll just add in some long-held notes, like violins. Instead of doing all this, jumping around, they just do a long sustaining thing, because that has a tendency to, even if there's things going on, something about a sort of drone makes it feel more calm. So you see, it's the chill version. Right, so there's your three. So then the idea is, we'll record all of these, and we stream them simultaneously. So here you can actually see, these are the actual files that are in the game. These are the real files. So right now we're starting on that middle one, and let's say we take out the last guy, and the system registers, oh, there's no more fighting going on. It will crossfade between the two performances. And because it's the same exact piece, you don't really feel the crossfade. It just kind of feels like the orchestra got quieter. And of course, it works the other way as well. So, big dude shows up, and we can, within a second or so, be caught up with you. Now, I'm leaving off a super important part of this. There's no melody in any of this music. Part of the whole idea of drawing inspiration from Miyazaki and Joe Hisaishi and these very traditional old-fashioned scores, they tend to be very melodic. You think of even like John Williams, melody's always king. And so melody is like, it's like the lead vocals of a song. You're listening to your favorite normal song, not like this kind of music. And the problem with melodies is that you cannot do any of those fades. At least I'm opposed to it. I consider it blasphemous. It's horrible. Because it's like if I'm talking to you and you just turn down, I just disappear like that. There's no way to not notice that happening, right? Or if you're just staring at me and I'm suddenly in the middle of the sentence, I just appear. I hate it. So you can see we actually have a fourth stream, and this is what it sounds like. Here's the actual melody. I must confess, because it's a little transitional, it's not the most interesting melody in the world in this particular excerpt, but you can see. So there's our melody, a work of astounding, blinding genius, clearly, on its own. So you can see, where'd it go? Make sure I'm on the right thing. Okay, so you can see how there was sort of two parts to that, right? You heard like the strings doing the, it wasn't that, da 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 da, and then French horns come in more defiantly, right? It's very clear. This is all making sense so far, right? I haven't left anyone behind. Okay, cool. So then I thought, what if instead of recording all of those melodies, first off, rather than recording them baked in to the performance with the orchestra, where we're all playing as one, I said I would be conducting the orchestra, and I'd say, if you have one of the melodies, don't play on this take. So then we'd get these, green, yellow, and red, essentially backing tracks, right? And then the melody becomes the top line of like the lead vocal. Think of it like that. So we can do our crossfade business with the backing tracks, but then the question is what to do with the melody so that we never feel it fade in or out. So the idea is, well, we'll get rid of the melody when you're downshifting as a way to really make it clear you're downshifting. So when you've killed all the enemies, the melody goes away. And if new enemies show up, we add melody back in. So how to avoid fading it up? So here's what I did. We recorded it in this back and forth checkerboard pattern so I could spread it across two parallel audio files. And the way that so there you go. So there's one in the bottom, and then enemies go away. It lets it play out, but it mutes the top one that's already silent. That makes sense? So you can see it's like if this exact moment is where I've killed the last guy, it mutes the one that's already silent, and then it waits until the other one is silent to mute it, so that we never feel it disappear. It just lets it reach a natural end. And of course, we can do that the other direction as well, where we are adding it in at the right moment, and then it has to wait. So the system can only ever mute or unmute when there's nothing going on. Obviously, if you're savvy to this kind of thing, it's probably pretty clear that what this means is that there might be a slight lag. Bad guy shows up and then the melody might come in whenever we hit the next one of those moments. And that was the trade-off we made. It will sound more naturally musical at the expense of being completely real time. Except don't forget, the crossfade to the higher intensity orchestra is happening in real time. So it's like we bring up one thing and then we bring up the other. And so here's just a little glimpse of that same gameplay clip where you can sort of see guys are gone, the music has settled down a little bit. It still keeps the spirit of the excitement, but whereas, when we want to ratchet it up, because big dudes are showing up, we can do that. So you see, it's one of those where it's like, it's sort of subtle, but it's not. You know, it's one of those where this outcome of a system like this means that I can write, 4 or 5 minute sort of combat loop, and if you play the game for an hour, you'll never actually hear the same thing. It'll never actually feel quite like a loop, because it's constantly changing, and statistically the odds of it actually hearing a big chunk of it the same way twice in a row are effectively zero.
We have time for one more clip if you have it, or is that all?
That's my big grand finale clip-wise, to bring it home and show how it all. Does all this make sense, though? I know I'm kind of talking fast, and that if you're maybe not as familiar with interactive music, this might feel a little rapid fire. But in fact, if we don't, I'm happy to also take a question or two if we don't run out of time, assuming
we got a couple of minutes. So.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So yeah. Anyway, this was. I should mention. I worked on this game for about 5.5 years. The first 2+ was completely different from this, because I was like, let's do something that's going to be very modular and sort of procedurally generated, and it's going to be something no one's ever seen before. And then as the game developed and the limits of the technology started to reveal themselves, I said, okay, we're going to have to come up with a different way to do this. And I literally threw out about 2.5 years worth of work and started over, and then came up with this instead. And then spent about 3 years writing music that uses this system.
And then how long did it take to record because you had to record the soundtrack multiple times over, presumably?
Yeah, I know, it was tedious. We would spend almost 3 hours recording about a 4-minute chunk of music because of this system, which is way slower than normal. But we got it done, and it was a week. We actually recorded it here in Los Angeles, which was amazing. Don't get to do that very often. Record a lot in London and Vienna, and other places like that. But we were able to record at the classic, Hollywood studio symphony that records, lots of big movie scores, and used to record a lot of game scores. The LA musicians still pretty regularly record on League of Legends, but that's pretty much the only title that is routinely recorded here. But yeah, it was on the Warner Brothers scoring stage. I talked about it having a swashbuckling quality. Well, the invention of that was the Warner Brothers movies in the 1930s and 40s, a composer named Eric Wolfgang Korngold, and we were literally recording in the same room that he recorded those scores in the 1940s. It was
fantastic.
Pretty freaking awesome. So yeah, never get tired of that. It's always a privilege to record here.
Thank you very much for showing us all of this. It's been fascinating. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.